Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned to talk about fantasy. So, I've done a couple of videos like this before. I did one on horror, I did one on science fiction, so I have to do one on fantasy, because over there, I have a bookshelf, and on the bookshelf are stacks of books, and each stack is a different genre. I've got horror and science fiction and fantasy and westerns and other stuff. And I'm taking you on a tour of my never-ending TBR shelf. It'll be a while before I get to all these books, but these are the next books in these genres that I'm going to get to. And today we are talking about fantasy. And the last couple of videos have been 15, but today is 18 because it's fantasy, and fantasy has to be ridiculously oversized, like always. So yeah, it's the 18 fantasy books that I'll be reading next, or the next 18 fantasy books that I'll be reading. It's one of those two, Roger. So, let's get right to it, because there's a lot of books here. And fantasy's tricky, man, because they're books that are parts of series, you know, so you got one saga that's multiple books. So I'm going to be, my math is going to be funny here. I'm going to be counting multiple books as one book, depending on, you know, on certain, I will explain when I get to them. The first one is obvious, because the first one is The Lord of the Rings, which I made an abortive attempt. Since I got on BookTube, I made an abortive attempt to reread The Lord of the Rings, which I hadn't read in full since I can't remember, but it's been a long time. It's been a long time. And so I read The Hobbit, and then I read some other stuff, and then I read The Fellowship of the Ring, and then I read some other stuff, and some other stuff, and some other stuff, and then was like, oh wait, wasn't I going to be reading Lord of the Rings? But now I'm in this huge reading event. Oh no! So I made a mistake. What I should have done is what I'm going to be doing this time, and just read the whole thing all at once, as if it were one book. And you're going to say, well, that could work for The Lord of the Rings, but what about The Hobbit? Isn't that a different book? Let's pretend. I mean, it's the introduction to the Lord of the... Let's pretend it's all one. I mean, it fits all in this box. Oh, wait, but what about this? Damn it. It's the Silmarillion. It's this thing. I've only read this once, and I read it when I was really young, after I'd read The Hobbit. And I was like, what the hell is this? I read the whole thing. Didn't get much of it, I think. But I've been due to reread this forever, so I'm going to put this together and pretend. I know it's not one book. I know it's not. But let's pretend, for the sake of my poor math skills, that this is all one book. But then that leads me to the problem. Should I read this before I read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings? Or should I read it after? Man, that's tough, Roger. You guys have got to help me out. Which order should I read? Which order should I read this in? I don't even know. But I'm going to pretend all of this is one gigantic book. One gigantic book, yeah. And this is my favorite set of Lord of the Rings. You can tell because it's all beat to hell. I mean, look at the poor Hobbit. The Hobbits had it, man. But I love this set of paperbacks. I love them. This is my favorite Lord of the Rings set, so I'm going to be reading these. And this, the Silmarillion. Either before or... You guys got to tell me. Which order should I read that in? Anyway, obviously that's the first thing. That's number one. I told you, it's fantasy. Everything is oversized. The next thing is this. This is Stephen Donaldson, The Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever. This is a trilogy of books, which is kind of controversial in the fantasy fan community, I think, because Thomas Covenant is just a really awful person, apparently. I haven't read the book, but apparently he's kind of a creep. So that doesn't bother me. I read about creeps all the time. So I could read about a creep in a big gigantic fantasy saga. So this is, I wish I had the paperbacks, like the old school paperbacks that like my mother had and I used to see when I was a little kid. Those were cool. Those had great covers. This cover, not as cool. But this does have the entire trilogy. But actually I have, they're three trilogies. They're three trilogies. Or was it four? I don't know. I've got at least 2 trilogies of this. So I'll read it all as one big thing. Again, I'm cheating, I know. But I'm counting this and the other trilogy that I have as one book. It's the Chronicles, man. It's the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever by Stephen Donaldson, which I've been needing to get to for like ever. So yeah, I'm going to be reading that. Also, let me move some stuff around. Monster Huntress by David Wiley. There's the great David Wiley there. Monster Huntress by David Wiley. I've been meaning to get to this for a long time too. I don't know why I haven't read it, but I have it, and you know, Monster Huntress, there you go. This is not the super awesome cover. There is an edition out now with a really cool cover, but this is the less awesome cover. But that's okay. It's still Monster Huntress by David Wiley. And I read one other book by David, and I really liked it. So I'm due to read this. Monster Huntress by David Wiley. David Wiley has an awesome BookTube channel, which you should all watch. I will link it down below if I remember. Next, Variconium by M. John Harrison. Variconium by M. John Harrison. This was published as multiple books, right? This is more than one book. I read one of them, which I think was a paperback, a smaller standard size paperback or mass market paperback called The Pastel City, which is part of this. And I remember really liking it. I thought it was great. But I didn't have any of the other books, and I picked up The Pastel City used. So, but it was really interesting, really good. So this is this the whole of Variconium by M. John Harrison? I don't know. It's the Fantasy Masterworks edition. So I'm going to read this because I've been intending to get to read this thing, like I said, forever. I've been meaning to get to this forever. So now I'm going to get to it. Variconium by M. John Harrison. It's supposed to be great. So there's that. Next, Carl Edward Wagner, Kane. So last year, right? There was an event called February Fantasy Stories that no longer exists, I don't believe, because the channel that did it, the Bookish Bryants, they don't make videos anymore. So I'm assuming we probably won't get February Fantasy Stories anymore. But it did exist at one time, and it was awesome. And I read all of the short stories written by Carl Edward Wagner about Kane in a companion volume to this one. But this volume, Gods in Darkness, has all the Kane novels. So Bloodstone, Dark Crusade, Darkness Weaves. So I read the short stories. Now I'm going to read all the novels. And I have read these before, but again, it was many, 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 many years ago. And I really like Carl Edward Wagner. He's a great writer. And this was a very important dark fantasy series. So yeah, I want to get back to this series and read the novels. So I'm going to read that. Okay. What's next? Well, definitely want to get back to this fantastic writer. One of the most influential fantasy writers who ever lived, and that was Lord Duncani. So this is Time and the Gods by Lord Duncani, and this is the Fantasy Masterworks edition. So this has a few different books in here because Lord Duncani wrote short little collection. He put out short little collections of fantasy stories, which are wonderful. They're just wonderful classic fantasy stories. Again, they've been very influential on authors as different as H.P. Lovecraft on one side and J.R.R. Tolkien on the other. So he's had a pretty big influence, Lord Dunsany, and his stories are beautiful. They're just beautiful fantasy stories. I've been intending to get back to them forever, so this is on the shelf so I could revisit Lord Dunsany in this Fantasy Masterworks edition. So I'm going to do that. Here's another book that I've been meaning to get to. I've been meaning to get through this since I started doing BookTube, which was over 2 years now, I guess. I guess it has been. And a viewer actually recommended this, and I picked it up and never read it. And that's Mythical Wood. Mythical Wood by Robert Holdstock. And it's supposed to be great. It's literally been on my TBR for over 2 years. But I really want to read it. It's like a million other books that I've been waiting to read forever, and I really want to read. This is one of those books. Supposed to be excellent, Mythical Wood. Supposed to be excellent. I think this is the first book in a series, I think. But this is the only one I have. So, Mythical Wood by Robert Holdstock. Going to read that. This is an interesting little one. This is King of the World's Edge by H. Warner Munn, which is a little fantasy book that I've never read. And this author's biggest claim to fame, I think, is that he knew H.P. Lovecraft. But I read one other book by him, which was The Werewolf of Ponkert, which might be the only other book that this guy wrote. I could be wrong, and let me know if I'm wrong. But that's the only other book I know of by H. Warner Munn. And so this sounds interesting. They were a lonely, half-starved band of adventurers who had been cast out of their homeland by hordes of invading marauders, and they came to an unknown world, as strange, as fantastic, as wonder-packed as the legendary Atlantis. I mean, it sounds cool. So yeah, King of the World's Edge by H. Warner Munn. I'm going to read that. What else am I going to read? I'm going to read Clark Ashton Smith. So I want to revisit Clark Ashton Smith because this guy, one of the big three of Weird Tales, every bit as talented as Robert E. Howard or H.P. Lovecraft. Just a very different writer with a very different style. And he wrote different kinds of things. I mean, he wrote science fiction, he wrote horror, but everything he wrote was kind of fantasy, which is why you will find his stories in a Fantasy Masterworks edition. Because really, it was fantasy, and it was amazing fantasy in its own way. Just really unique. Beautiful stuff. So, Clark Ashton Smith. I'm going to read this Fantasy Masterworks edition. And this one was edited by Stephen Jones. This was edited by Stephen Jones with a bunch of really cool stories in it. So yeah, I'm going to revisit Clark Ashton Smith with this, The Emperor of Dreams. The Emperor of Dreams. So, going to read that. Also going to read Silverlock by John Myers Myers. Silverlock by John Myers Myers. Which, when I first saw this cover, I thought, man, this has got to be ridiculous. But I've heard a lot of good things about this book. Apparently, this is a really good book. I had never heard of it before I got it. Got this old Ace edition of Silverlock by John Myers Myers. I don't really know much about it. Just that it has something to do with fantasy and literary characters who already existed in other books. So that's as much as I know about Silverlock. So Silverlock by John Myers Myers. I'm going to read this. Have you read this book? Some people have, apparently. Next, Talons Guest. Talons Guest by Charles McGarry. This is another one that's been on my TBR for a long time. And another one that I don't know why I haven't read it yet. Fantasy novel by Charles McGarry, which I think is an episodic kind of novel. Charles McGarry is a booktuber. He has a booktube channel, Bookish Chas. Check him out. I'll link it down below. Finally going to get to Talons Guest. Finally going to get to it. So There's this one. Next, Fletcher Pratt's The Well of the Unicorn. The Well of the Unicorn, which I think this was written in the 40s, the 1940s, I think. Let me see. Let me make sure I'm not completely wrong. It was written in copyright 1948. This paperback is from the 70s, but it's from 1948 by Fletcher Pratt. The Well of the Unicorn, supposed to be a respected fantasy novel, which I have never read, but I'm going to read it. The Well of the Unicorn. The Well of the Unicorn. There you go. Okay. This one was one that I read when I was probably too young to really read it, and that is this book, The Worm Ouroboros. The Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Edison. And I did pick this up probably shortly after I had read The Lord of the Rings for the first time. And this is quite a bit different. And the language, which is deliberately antiquated, from what I remember, gave me a little bit of a hard time at first. I got into the swing of things, and I remember it being pretty good. But I would like to read this, as an adult, as an old person, as an elderly person. E.R. Edison's The Worm Ouroboros. So yeah, definitely. Another fantasy masterworks. They make cool books. So definitely going to be reading this one. Okay, we're down to the last few, I think. So obviously this is a series that I need to get to. Again, Elric. I've been intending to get back to Elric for a long time. He's on the shelf over there. I'm going to read Elric because there's a couple different ways you could read Elric. There's the new hardcover editions that have come out recently that tell his story chronologically, which if you've never read Elric before, that's probably the way to do it. This series of books, the Del Rey series, presents the stories in the order that they were first published, more or less. More or less, I believe that's how it's done in this series. And there's more stuff in the Del Rey series than there are in the hardcover set. There's like extra stuff. And so, I want the extra stuff. So I'm going to read the Del Rey series of Elric. I know people give this series a hard time because a lot of people don't like the art on the covers or on the interior. I kind of like it. So I'm going to read the Elric series, the Del Rey series, and then there's stuff that wasn't in this, and then I'll read that. Because there was a book that was just published there was an Elric book that was just published. I want to read that. So definitely Elric. Gotta get back to Elric because he's awesome. Okay, getting to some big ones now, including Brian Lee Durfee's The Forgetting Moon, which is part 1 of the 5 Warrior Angels. Brian Lee Durfee, fantastic booktuber, one of the best. Great, this guy has a great channel. It's great. I've been intending to read this forever, but the size of it, so it's 3 books, and they're all very large. I have it on audiobook, and I started listening to it because I don't really do audiobooks. And I was listening to it, I was like, this is so good, I want to actually read it because I feel like it would give me a better experience. And then I never had time to read it. So I'm going to make time to read the 5 Warrior Angels, which I'm, it was originally going to be a 5-book series, I think, and then it turned out to be, he ended up making it 3 fat paperbacks in a trilogy. Let's pretend it's all one book. Let's pretend. And it begins with this, The Forgetting Moon. Supposed to be excellent. And the little I listened to was fantastic. And I was like, man, I really want to read this. So I'm going to read it. Next. Okay, so this is kind of big. Because it's, like I said, fantasy. Everything's ridiculously oversized. This is The Great Book of Amber. The Great Book of Amber the Complete Amber Chronicles 1 through 10. So it was published as 10 books. But it's in this one book. It's The Great Book of Amber by Roger Zelazny. And I've read some other books by Roger Zelazny that I've really liked. But I've never read any of these Amber books. And it's a fantastic, ginormous paperback. So yeah, the Great Book of... It's great. It even says it's great. It's The Great Book of Amber. So it's got to live up to... It's got to live up to that title. So there you go. The Great Book of Amber. Going to read that. Last couple here. So I started this next series, which I'm going to count as one unfinished work. This is George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. In this old-time paperback, they don't say that on... Did they say that on the... It's just Game of Thrones in this paperback. Oh, yeah, it does. Book 1 in A Song of Ice and Fire. So, A Song of Ice and Fire. I read the first two of these way back in the olden days. You know, when the paperbacks look like this. And I was like, this is so good. I'm just going to wait till he finishes the series. And then I'll read them all at once. That'll be awesome. So, by this time, it's painfully obvious, to me anyway, that George R.R. Martin is never, ever, ever going to finish this series. He's just not going to finish it. Somebody else might. But George R.R. Martin, no, man, he's not going to finish this series. So, I'm going to consider it an unfinished work and finally read all of the existing books of A Song of Ice and Fire. Really liked the first couple books. So I'm just going to read them all as one, you know. Now this next one is big. I've talked about this before. This is the book, this is the Malazin Book of the Fallen, which I'm going to read all as one book. I actually have an ebook called The Complete Malazin Book of the Fallen. But this is the paperback. And there are 11 paperbacks, and each one gets progressively more giant. This one isn't that giant. This one's only 660 pages long. But they get really, really, really big because, you know, Steven Erikson, he just has to go on and on, I guess. Again, I read the first two books in this series. Really impressed with both of them. And I've always felt like this would be the kind of thing that would be both really challenging and really fun to read the whole series in one go. Like, not breaking it up with anything else. Just reading the whole series in one go. Seeing how long it would take. And just, you know, just experiencing it that way. And it's not crazy. I mean, other people have done this. Plenty of other people on BookTube have done that. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read the Malazin Book of the Fallen all as one book. That is to say, I'll read the whole series all in one go. It's just, when the hell am I going to do that? I literally have to read everything else I own before I get to it, right? Because it's going to be like, I've thought about this, right? It would have to be, because whenever I did it, how long would it take to do that? It would take like a year, right? Because I'm slow. How long would it take to read all those books? And to do it in an unbroken way would be difficult because I've got June on the range, right? So it would have to start it after June, but then there's also all these other reading events. So what I would have to do this is cut out pretty much every other reading event except June on the range. That's my event, so I'm not going to cut that. And just read Malazin Book of the Fallen for like a year or something. Because it's 11 books and they're giant. I'm going to have to think on this one about how I'm going to accomplish this. But it's going to be accomplished. It's in my mind as an insane ambition. An insane reading ambition. So it'll happen one of these days. Okay. I'll shut up now. We'll catch you next time.